What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at Prelude Dark Pain, an upcoming TRPG that is meant to be releasing into early access a little later this year, sometime in Q3, give or take. But I am bringing you this video via a playtest that I was invited to by the game's developers, which has given me a pretty good idea of what this game will ultimately be about, and so let's get into it. Now, primarily speaking, this is, again, a tactical title, turn-based tactics battles. However, I was a little pleasantly surprised to find out that there's a fair bit more to the game as well. There is a world map that you'll be navigating. There are side quests, quests that will pop up randomly in the world. There will be factions to interact with on that world map, random encounters, and more yet to come. So, as far as this playtest goes, what it basically is the opening couple of hours of the title, in which we get the basis for the setting and a lot of the core mechanics. Now, for early access later this year, it should be the entirety of the first act of the game, roughly half but not all of the playable heroes, of which there are more than 20 planned, and a bit more to go on the progression side of things. And just to throw it in here somewhere, pretty big fan of the art style. Seems to remind me a lot of Darkest Dungeon in particular. Would not be surprised if that was one of their influences here. Otherwise, though, let's get into this before I throw my thoughts at the end of this video. But what is this game actually about? Well, Prelude Dark Pain takes place in a dark fantasy title, as the name would probably imply. In particular, however, we play primarily as a guy known as Soren, a retired warrior turned blacksmith who just so happens to be married to a witch who became the target of the Order of the Ashen Crusade. Now, these guys are interesting. They seem to have a few different arms of their overall force. However, their main goal seems to basically be to spread fear and terror throughout their territory in order to worship a being known as the Lord of Pain. This seems to be implied to be some sort of deity, but obviously there are bigger plans there. Basically, in doing all of these terrible acts for this malignant being, they are creating tears in the world, rifts, if you will, through which creatures of pain can break through and cause even bigger problems, which are going to, of course, make up a fair few of the enemies you have to fight. So not only do you need to save your family from the attack that was visited upon you by these guys right at the beginning of the game, but you'd also like to put a stop to what they're doing, and so you need to rally the forces of the free people and try to fight back, of course. Now, what was interesting to me here is you have the usual main quest stuff as well, but there is that world map where you can find things like various side quests to get up to, which, I mean, typically just leads to more tactical battles, but give you a variety of content to see through that way. The reward for doing a lot of that stuff is typically equipment, levels, progression, which is all going to feed back into doing things like forging items, gaining power, the typical sort of RPG progression. However, this is not a random set of people that you'll be recruiting. There are 20 plus more or less hero characters who will have different abilities, types of gameplay, etc. The max party size seems to be roughly 5, with each hero, of course, having unique things going on. Now, they are grouped up into categories like bruiser, controller, that kind of thing. However, each hero individually has a special passive and typically unique mechanics that make them play a bit differently no matter what. For instance, your main guy Soren is a rogue who can easily get behind enemy lines and focuses on applying bleeding to things and then taking advantage of that status effect. Whereas Maya is an archer who has the ability to push enemies back with her arrows, but this also shoves them into walls and things, which can cause them to be stunned and lock down enemies via manipulating the battlefield directly. And that's important because combat utilizes things like flanking rules and whatnot, but you don't have like a zone of control around your characters, and so stunning enemies and forcing them to be where you want them to be so they can't get behind you and take advantage of rear attacks or flanks seems to be an important aspect of the combat. But before we dive into that too much, I mentioned a little bit of the progression systems there. So while the numbers are obviously very subject to change at this point, more on that in a moment, as your characters participate in battles and the like, they will level up. As they level up, they will occasionally gain attribute points, which they can put into one of 6 attributes, which will of course increase their stats, and you get to decide where that goes. Obviously, what kind of character you're playing and what they specialize in are going to play a pretty big role here, but things like attack power, health, your overall hit chance are obviously some of the big stuff to keep in mind there. But the other half of progression is skills. You get a lot more skill points than you do attribute points, and each individual character has 2 skill trees that kind of focus on one or the other part of their overall tool set. Like your main character's son, Tizon, I think his name is, has the ability to focus on either his guns or his devices. Being the son of a blacksmith, he himself is a bit of a tinkerer and can throw out things like little makeshift turrets or bear traps, that kind of thing, and control the battlefield through that means. But with that out of the way, let's talk about the battles themselves. So interestingly enough, we have neither a action point system or move in an action system even, but rather you're given several different options and the ability to build up battle points that you can then spend on doing various things. Now, by default, every character can move, attack, defend, or simply use a skill in their turn, etc. But you can also do all of those things in a single turn. For the most part, you can do them in any order. However, once you run out of battle points, you can no longer defend. Defending is important because, as I mentioned, things can attack your flanks or your rear, and the only way to protect against that, outside of just not getting hit there, is the defend action to end your turn. This protects you from those. And without a dedicated zone of control in order to keep enemies from attacking you there, your options are that defend ability or simply dominating the battlefield and making sure enemies can't get to you via things like stunning, taking their turns away, simply manipulating the battlefield in such a way that that's not possible, like your directional changes, that kind of thing. But otherwise, you can move, attack, use a skill, and pretty much in any order. This allows you a fair bit of freedom that, truth be told, I think is going to be hard to balance around. So just to kind of rip the band-aid off here with the thing I noticed the most, initiative seems to be, at least currently via this playtest, which might change over the course of an early access, a really big deal. And the reason for that being that a lot of times if you don't go first, or if there's several enemies that go first, they will typically tag team your weakest character very quickly, and that character is just down for the fight. They res after if you win, which you probably will. But the flip side of that being, because you have so much freedom in terms of what you can do on your turn, it's also pretty easy to just lock all of the enemies down, even against like a boss, especially once you start getting things like equipment and everything under your belt, which is going to make you particularly difficult for these enemies to deal with. Like I mentioned, Maya can shoot arrows, which will knock enemies into things and stun them. Soren has the ability to turn himself invisible, but also more or less guarantee a crit on a bleeding enemy, which will deal just massive damage and just delete those guys. Tizon seems to be able to just throw out things like bear traps at will for a single battle point, so multiple times per round, and that will actually immobilize the enemies you hit with it. You get a really great tank character who can not only weaken enemies by opening up their armor, but also builds up a passive shield as he attacks things, and can also taunt them if he wants. And so you seem to have a lot of freedom in how you approach all of this. And that's without even getting into your big AoE characters. But another thing this battle system seems to really focus in on is height and positioning in individual battles. So as I mentioned, you can knock enemies into things or people and stun them. Well, certain battlefields, you'll actually be able to knock them off of things and instantly kill them. And the only thing that seems to be immune to that are bosses, which have an immovable trait. Height also plays a role, however. There are multiple levels of terrain, and the higher you are in comparison to an enemy, up to a few tiers, you'll deal more damage to them, which is obviously going to be a very big advantage for ranged characters. So there's a lot going on there. Now, it's very bare bones here in this playtest, but it does look like there is meant to be some choice and consequence in this game as well. In particular, you are given the option to spare or kill someone, and you are explicitly told that this will come back in consequences later. How true that is ultimately something you won't be able to really tell until the actual full game releases, but that's what we know right now. Which is, I think, the point at which I want to start wrapping this up. Long story short, this game has some promising things going on with it. I dig the art style, the game is fun enough. This was a playtest. I think my main thing of feedback would be really just balancing. These battles mostly went one of two ways, which is that enemies either got their turns first and managed to just immediately gang up and kill a single character, or it's my turn and I get to dominate the field so thoroughly that I win without them ever really having a chance. And I also think a few of the UI elements here and there could be a little clearer, like when you're trying to forge armor, maybe, showing me not only what I have, but what individual characters could or probably should equip it, that kind of thing, just giving you a little more information there. Or for instance, making enemies easier to inspect, to actually see what their abilities do. There is a way to do it, but it just feels a little off as it stands. So there's some game feel stuff I think they could certainly improve, but the overall core concepts are good, which is why I wanted to make this video, of course, and I will likely keep an eye on this one as it enters early access and eventually releases, but realistically, given that they want to release this into early access in roughly Q3, they are expecting it to be in early access for roughly a year. This is probably a 2027 review for down the line, and I'll be keeping an eye on it in the meantime. But for today, that is obviously pretty much going to do it. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.